Hi everyone, welcome to the second week of our course, Race and American Politics. My name is Fatih Çetin, the instructor of the course. Today, we will be discussing how the boundaries of different racial groups historically change in the United States. In doing so, we will actually revisit a few important themes which are widely discussed by Clara Rodriguez and Matthew Jacobs in the assigned readings. Okay, so these themes will be censuses, what type of categories have been prevalent in the census historically, how the citizenship issue has been changed over time in the United States, and how the boundaries and the meaning of whiteness change in the United States. Let's start with the first one, censuses. Think a few seconds about why censuses matter for our political life. Actually, in 2020, there were new cycle of census administered in the United States, and there were important discussions going on it. The census are important for the apportionment or allocation or distribution of different political and economic resources in the United States. These resources are such as the boundaries of congressional districts are determined based on how many people live in a current district. The seats in the Congress, which each state belongs to, historic change every 10 years as a result of new census records, or federal funds, the distribution of them among different states again change as a result of how many people live there. So the census are key tools of our political life in terms of determining the allocation, the apportionment of key political and economic resources. Okay, this is an important issue. Additionally, actually censuses historically emerged in relatively modern or contemporary times as a tool devised by the nation states to legibilize their population, to make them accessible for more effective governance of the population for political, economic, and administrative purposes. So founded as a nation state, the United States started to apply or administer population census in the late 18th century, in 1790. Okay. So, especially in the late 18th and the entire 19th century, the basic paradigm used in census categories was color. Okay. The categories sometimes change, but they were generally revolving around whites, colored frees, and colored slaves populations. Okay. In the Naturalization Act of 1790, it was declared that only the whites have birthright citizenship rights. Okay. So in the early on, in very first acts, documents, and processes of founding of the country, whites were declared as the prime constituent groups, and this reflected itself in the construction of census categories and the boundaries. Okay. In 1850, actually, it was again very explicitly indicated in many congressional documents that Nordic and Anglo-Saxon white groups were taken as the major and most important political group in the country, which allowed the country to compete with other European powers. So it was taken in the national interest to preserve the genetic purity and racial stock of the country. Okay, so this issue, this political consideration actually increased the anxiety regarding the presence of, let's say, internal others that will threaten this racial purity, such as mixed race people, or non-white groups. Okay, the mixed race category has been added to the census as a result of that in the late 19th century. Similarly, like other so-called racial categories such as Chinese, Japanese, and some other like so-called European races has been added into the census categories. Actually, in the 20th century, racial concepts and categories replaced the color categories in the preparation and the administration of the census. Okay. So, African Americans, this is how they are called today, actually like freed blacks and non-freed or like slave, non-white slaves or colored slaves. There has been other categories in the first census and the census in the 19th century. Okay. So African Americans, like these slaved African Americans, have been counted as 3/5, like less than one, 3/5 of an average person. And they are also counted as properties of the household. Okay, it's an important issue. Native Americans, how we call them today, actually they were called Indians at that time. At that time, ironically, in a very historically distorted way, because Christopher Columbus, who discovered the area, thought that he ended up being in India, and he called everyone he encountered there as Indians, although they were nothing to do with the people of India at that time. So the category of Indians, like text Indians, untext Indians, has been other categories in the 19th century. By the way, you don't need to worry so much about these changing terms in the census category, especially very minor changes. I will be pointing out very important major changes, okay, reflecting the like political circumstances of the era, such as the colored category was dominant in the 19th century, whereas the race category was dominant in the 20th century. Okay. In 1950, actually, France, for the first time, it was indicated in the census documents that race is not a fixated, not a static, not an immutable, not a biological category. So it was said that it is a social category. So a very important paradigm shift. This showed itself actually much more concretely in 1970, when now people were allowed to self-express to which racial category they belong to in these like censuses. In 2000 census, for the first time in history, people were allowed to choose more than one racial category. Okay, so the birth of biracialism or multiracialism as a legal political category. Okay, so these are important like information and dates about the history of census in the United States. Actually, these censuses also reflect the changing paradigm of citizenship in the United States. Okay, as we just mentioned a few minutes ago, in 1790, it was explicitly declared that birthright citizenship only belonged to whites in the country. So colored free population, these are free African Americans or free blacks and text Indians were also accepted into citizenship, but in practice, de facto, in everyday life, in the political life, they were treated as second-class citizens. Okay, an important issue. Actually, in 1850s, the citizenship rights of African Americans has been a very contentious topic that a very notorious ruling, Dred Scott ruling by the Supreme Court, actually declared that African Americans, actually they are using the N word, these blacks are not entitled to gain citizenship, okay, due to their color. Civil War broke up as a result of like this controversy, and as a result of the 13th Amendment, 14th Amendment, and the 15th Amendment, blacks or African Americans, they gained their right for full citizenship and political standing, although these rights were later on reversed in the so-called Jim Crow era. However, Native Americans or American Indians, they had to wait until 1924 to attain their official birthright citizenship. Okay. Now, let's discuss about the boundaries, changing boundaries of whiteness, actually, which refers, so far, all the topics that we discussed were taken from Clara Rodriguez's like chapter, but now we will be talking about Matthew Jacobs chapter, okay? So, as he pointed out, in the second half of 19th century, especially until 1920s, Anglo-Saxon and Nordic exclusivity dominated the conception of whiteness in the United States, which simply means that only the people from Anglo-Saxon backgrounds or people coming from the Northern Europe, they were taken as superior whites, which should be preserved or who should be preserved as the primary constituent groups of the country. Like some other European or Caucasian groups, whom we today associate with whiteness, such as Italians, such as Spanish, such as Irish, Celtic, Scottish, let's say people coming from Eastern Europe and let's say Southern Europe, they were treated as inferior white groups, okay, by the United States authorities. They were treated as undeserving, less intelligent, less competent, less worthy groups in the society. So especially in the late 19th century and early 20th century, their immigration into the country has been a very contentious topic, so that many anti-immigration organizations, many eugenic scholars, many political actors, many Supreme Court justices, like many important actors, they were mobilized to limit the entry or immigration of not only non-whites, other groups, but also white but inferior, so-called deep inferior groups from Eastern and Southern Europe. Okay. However, in 1924, as a result of Immigration Act of 1924, their entry into the country was like unprecedentedly, like considerably restricted, which in an ironic way attenuated within white racial anxieties. Okay. So this development, actually this time period, has been accompanied with some other developments, such as the great migration of African Americans from the southern region to the north, as well as growing mobilization, activism, and like social movements of civil rights movements and NAACP. Like both of these developments actually carry the race problem or so-called like black problem into the national political domain. Okay, it was another important development. Also, in the 1930s, horrifying Nazi experiences made it much more visible that racial thinking and racially based political discourses and policies and implementations had very deleterious, very horrifying consequences for millions of non-German, non-Aryan groups. So this made the danger of such thinking visible. So it has been politically much more costly for like the Southern whites for the United States to carry the same stigmatizing political stance. All of these developments actually moderated or undermined the political and scientific credibility of race-based thinking in the United States. Okay, in the 1920s, as a result of Immigration Act, starting with 1910s until 1950s, Great Migration, growing mobilization of civil rights movements, especially 1930s, 40s, 50s, okay, an important issue, and Nazi experiments, 1930s and 1940s. So we are talking about a historically very important time period, which eventually led to the discrediting of race-based thinking in the United States. So the category of race actually has been replaced by the category of ethnicity and culture. However, what has been the outcome of this paradigm shift? As a result of this paradigm shift, actually, whiteness lost their or its racial element. It has come to be seen as an ethnically diverse category. Ethnic diversity has been celebrated, like Irish, like Italian, like Caucasian groups or so-called European groups from Southern Europe and Eastern Europe, they were assimilated into dominant understanding of whiteness. Their assimilation, the facilitation or the precipitation of their assimilation into the country, the increasing power and visibility of these groups in the political and economic domain, the legitimization of their position and the alignment of their status with Nordic and Anglo-Saxon white groups actually led to the creation of a new white identity. However, to the detriment of non-white groups again. Why? Because these groups, their assimilation has been taken as the success stories, setting the expectation for other groups, leading to the vilification, okay, or the blaming of, let's say, African Americans or Jews or Asian Americans, their blaming, their vilification for their non-assimilation into the Americans, okay, although these groups were not aided or helped or their assimilation were not facilitated as some other European groups, okay. In the especially second half of the 20th century, when people thought about the term of race or a racial group or a racial identity, the first thing which came to people's minds were African Americans, let's say Asian Americans, like Hispanic Americans, but non-whites. Whites are no longer taken as a racial category. Whiteness has no longer taken as a racial identity. And it was the case, especially until quite recently, until 2010s. Okay. So, to briefly summarize, the boundaries of different racial groups are floating social constructs. It was informed by political struggles, political anxieties, and political discussions. So we cannot talk about a static, given, immutable, fixated boundary between different racial groups. The content and even the concept of different racial groups and identities and cleavages demarcating one from another historically change. We can trace these change in censuses and the categories used in their administration, or in some other political essays and policies and processes and arts and scientific discourses, as Matthew Jacobs has demonstrated. Okay, so this is kind of the brief overview of what these two readings are trying to tell for us. Again, I know there are like myriad number of facts, myriad number of information, myriad number of dates, like numerous acts. You might understandably think that you might need to like memorize all of these information, but please don't do that. Just focus on the basic punchlines, what these authors are trying to achieve, and how they develop their argumentation. And don't let yourself be swamped in the details. Okay, you can use these videos as auxiliary, helpful resources in reading these like texts. Okay, so thanks so much for listening, and I'm looking forward to seeing you in another video.